Oh, way down south in the land of traders, rattlesnakes and alligators. Right away, come away, right away, come away.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. You are listening to one Evan Buck, who is temporarily taking show host duties today. And of course, I would be remiss if I do not mention my favorite and, as of now, only tagline on the show. Hey, everyone, how's it going? It's your boy, Evan. Joining me today are two distinguished gentlemen, and in no particular order, I will first say hello to Chris Coppola.
Hi, good people.
And Dylan Holzmer.
Hello, everyone.
Still needs a tagline. Just saying. That's not stolen from Chris.
You know what? Honestly, Discord people, throw some stuff out there.
Yeah,
we're gonna
give our boy Dylan
on
some
the Discord.
love. Yeah, we'll pull in the Discord on this. Maybe
You know what?
we can run like a poll.
I honestly, I feel like I kind of want to have Dylan's tagline somehow be Bodie McBoatface, something like that. Because that's what happens when you put things for a vote out on the internet.
I mean, if we have to make him sign a contract that he will, in fact, say whatever Discord says, that'll probably have a little bit more participation from Discord as a result.
Look, I didn't go to alternate history law school for 3 years to be called Bodie McBoatface. It's Dr. Bodie McBoatface.
But did you specialize in maritime law at alternate history law?
No, that was the sovereign citizen minor that I didn't take.
Oh, dang it. Yeah. I bet you're regretting that right about now. But anyway.
I do not consent.
Well, wait, that would make you a sovereign citizen.
Exactly.
But anyway, it's very appropriate that the start of this episode is us meandering through irrelevant things because we spent a good portion of our pre-podcast discussion also having ADHD levels of redirection and thinking about other things. But we promise we are actually going to get to the topic for discussion today. And if you have somehow just been struck with blindness between the time you opened this episode and started listening to it, the episode title is kind of already given away where we're going to be talking about. And that is a continuation of our Lincoln loss timeline, a timeline wherein Abraham Lincoln does not become the 16th president of the United States, and instead one William Seward ends up becoming the Republican nominee and is the president during the opening salvos of the Civil War, the American Civil War. And with that, I'll turn the reins over to Dylan to kind of help bring us up to speed on what has happened so far and what we set up in part one and where we're going to take things for part two. So Dylan, take it from here.
Yeah. So basically the gist of the idea is just a recap of part one, because the 1860 convention was moved and Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, which was at then probably the biggest Republican paper and one of the biggest papers in the entire country, because Horace and Seward didn't have a falling out. Seward becomes the Republican nominee for president. And as a result of the fractured, to put it lightly, nature of the rest of the presidential field in 1860, he wins the election. And what that does is, with a much more pro-abolition, anti-slavery candidate, as opposed to Lincoln, who tried to have this very nuanced constitutional position of, no extension, but preservation where it existed, believing that it would naturally die out. Seward having a much more anti-slavery, pro-abolitionist, kind of radical Republican platform. This is going to engender much more unease and secessionist sentiment in the South than we saw in our timeline in more states. And so the result is going to be, especially in the aftermath of Fort Sumter, which that's already started kicking off before the election even happens. So it's not changing in this timeline. So once Sumter happens, once Fort Sumter is fired upon, basically the first shots of the Civil War after South Carolina secedes, you're going to see a slightly larger Confederacy. We talked about, maybe even parts of Maryland, Kentucky, maybe even more significant secessionist sentiment in a border state like Missouri. You're going to see kind of a larger Confederacy develop in the early days of the Civil War. But also, one other interesting thing that Seward is going to represent, actually, two things. The first one, with a more anti-slavery open undercurrent of the Civil War, because in our timeline, it was all about quote unquote states' rights from the Southern perspective, which allowed them to kind of carry on this fantasy of, okay, we have to do well enough that Britain and France can join the war and recognize our independence and force the Union to the bargaining table. Because of the more open anti-slavery nature of this Civil War, that is not going to be on the table. Britain and France are not going to want to, on the international stage, be associated with recognizing an openly pro-slavery new nation when basically the entire world except Brazil has already turned away from slavery. The other thing I want to bring up, Seward has this really interesting concept of what is going on. Even in the early days of, in our timeline, the Lincoln administration, Seward believes that there is this almost like a Nixon era silent majority of people in the South that don't want to secede. He believes there's this giant, unnoticed, unappreciated, unspoken pro-union sort of source of support in the South. And he believes that if we can just keep from aggravating the secessionists any more than they already have, because at this point, South Carolina has seceded. The other ones have variously had their conventions or are having their conventions, and they've met in Montgomery to form the new Confederate government. But that is basically literally all they've done. They are still, getting their sea legs in terms of actually creating this new nation state. So Seward thinks if we just kind of chill, eventually cooler heads are going to prevail, and these wackos are going to realize, hey, wait, we didn't actually want to do this. We want to come back, and everything's going to be copacetic after we just have some frank discussions about, hey, you insulted me. Let's not do that again. He is unfortunately very much mistaken, but that is kind of, at least in the early days, especially basically kind of the first half to 2/3 probably of 1861, even after Sumter, Seward is going to be operating under.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, are we saying that this is almost kind of like a quasi Buchanan position? I mean, Buchanan basically just kind of threw up his hand and is like, look, I want nothing to do with this. They can do whatever they want. But Seward is coming in with this idea of, well, maybe if I just don't do anything, it'll all kind of die down on its own.
I think the one thing that Stewart draws a line at is secession.
Yeah.
I think he says, that is a hard line for me. Once you're over that.
Well, I think the line is going to be military action.
Oh.
Because the distinction between Seward and Buchanan is Buchanan was quite literally watching all this unfold and like checking off days on his calendar until he was out of the White House, and it wasn't his problem.
Because like, this is no longer my issue. It's Lincoln is inheriting all this.
Yeah, literally in his diary, he basically says, I cannot wait. He's like, I just want nothing to happen until I can go back to the farm, and then it is someone else's problem. That's Buchanan's MO. Seward, I think, because of his experience in as a senator from New York, as I think he was a former governor at one point. Seward has much more experience in direct statecraft. So I think until there is like an actual, and even with Sumter, that's going to be kind of its own thing. I think until there's an actual military battle, I think Seward is going to at least have this view of, okay, this is a negotiating thing. This is a deal-making thing. We can bring them back into the fold if we just talk to the right people, make the right promises. Even if I don't want to make the promises they want me to make, there's some kind of deal, some kind of discussion that can be had to meet the minds before we meet rifles. And so I think what the first thing that does is that actually delays the true outset of the Civil War by a couple of months. I think it's the first Bull Run / Manassas, depending on where you grew up and how you learned it in history.
No. It was Bull Run.
Okay,
When you lose a war, you don't get to name anything.
that's how look. I understand. I'm just trying to make the reference for people.
Show me Königsberg on a map. Show me Königsberg. Doesn't exist. When you lose a war, you lose the naming rights.
Yeah. So basically, what Chris is referring to is the North and the South, the Union and the Confederacy, name battles different ways. It's kind of like how the armies get named. So the South names their armies for regions, whereas the Union names their armies for the most part for rivers. So the Army of the Potomac, the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Ohio versus the Ohio River, not the Ohio State, versus the Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of Texas, the Army of the Mississippi Valley. I forget what. Too many armies. The South does battles the same way, where I think the Union this time names it after towns, and the South names it after whatever stream it was by. Or
No,
get that backwards,
Bull Run
is the stream.
A body of water. Manassas is down.
So basically, the Union likes rivers, the South likes towns, is all you have to remember for the naming convention. But anyway, Bull Run Manassas happens in June of 1861, I think, or July, I forget. But basically, this kind of midsummer in our timeline. And that's kind of the first moment when everybody's like, oh, crap, this is actually a war. We got to get our stuff together. Whereas in this timeline, because of this attitude that Seward has, I think it's actually going to be further into August, even into September, maybe, like kind of winter is approaching before there's really any kind of military dust up that really triggers the realization that this is an actual war. And so I think that's going to change kind of the tactical development of the war, because at that point, really what you're looking at is, even if they have a battle or two in August, September, early October, you're quickly running into harvest season and the winter when you can't really campaign. So
This
real
is still when
combat
there
is gonna
was
be-
such a thing as campaigning season.
Exactly. So real combat is probably not going to truly get started until 1862.
So, the question I have, I just want to make sure I understand what we're putting together here. Seward is stricter on the slavery issue.
Yeah.
Does, in our timeline, Lincoln calling for troops causes the secession of kind of a northern ring of states?
Yeah.
Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, debatably Kentucky and Missouri. And we've said that those areas are probably going to secede. If Seward is hanging back and not pushing a military conflict, is he preparing? Is he calling out state militias in case there is a conflict? And how does that affect what I just talked about with the secession of that northern ring? Do they go because of his stance on slavery, or is that still not happening yet?
So I think he is going to call up some troops, especially after Sumter, because that is a moment where it's like, okay, there has been some bloodshed. There has to be some response. But I think he's going to call up some troops, whether it's the same amount that Lincoln did or not, because Lincoln called up troops from every state. Seward may go ahead and say, we can't trust the troops from southern states, so we're going to call them up from New England and kind of the Rust Belt.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I think because Seward still has this belief of there's the possibility of negotiation and rapprochement, I think when he calls up the troops, he's going to basically do all this broadcasting of, I promise I'm not doing this to invade you. I really want you to come talk to me. So I think he's going to kind of try and straddle the fence, but because of his more anti-slavery stance, I think it's going to be, the end result is going to be much like what we saw in our timeline.
Yeah, his reputation is going to precede him. Like we developed a lot in the first part. Seward is not known for really being a very, magnanimous, touchy-feely, super polite person. Like he's known for being kind of using his bully pulpit, legislating well. it makes him a lot of like ideological friends and like pragmatic friends, but it also makes him a lot of enemies as well.
Yeah.
And
Like
so,
to give you an idea, Lincoln once asked Seward for some notes on his inaugural speech. Seward gave him 16 pages of notes on a speech that is about 3 paragraphs long.
yeah. And I mean, at that point, you might as well just be like trying to self-insert yourself into the
That's
role
literally
of
what he did,
president.
basically.
That's basically what he was trying to do. Seward likes to hear himself talk. And
Yeah,
so,
and he thinks he is the smartest man in the room, regardless of the evidence to the contrary.
yeah,
So,
he thinks he's the main character and he has main character energy, even though, like, definitely in our timeline, he absolutely was not. And
Yeah.
so, I did want to bring up quickly before we kept going about like fascinating back and forth on battles and battle strategy and generals. Listening to part one on this might be a little bit of a whiplash to what we're saying now, because when part one, we basically kind of set up this idea of, hey, look, Seward is a more, aggressive kind of person. Lincoln is more at the start of the war, very conciliatory, very, trying to give every possible, off ramp for the South. And so we kind of said in part one that Seward is more likely than not going to not care about forcing the South to shoot first at Fort Sumter, for example. Seward is just probably going to send in the gunboats, all that kind of stuff, not care quite as much. And so regardless of what is seen as like the actual like first shots, really, because Fort Sumter, even in our timeline, is not seen as like the first battle or whatever. It's, the Battle of Bull Run in July. So I think regardless of what happens at Fort Sumter, we're not really changing that in this episode. Instead, what we're kind of developing and seeing is just the tone and the tenor of the war being seen as a much different way than it panned out in the beginning stages of the canonical timeline. Regardless of the actual, like, either personal characteristics or desires of a President Seward, oftentimes perception is way more important than reality. And so
Yeah.
so just for those who might be listening to parts 1 and 2 back to back, I just kind of wanted to clarify that we're not really backtracking per se on what we established in part 1. We're just kind of, Dylan particularly kind of had a little bit of there's actually a little bit of a different reality of what we think about Seward versus what we might have, conveyed in part 1. So I just want to put that out there for everyone.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. Yeah, I read in between recording parts 1 and 2, I read Eric Larson's new book, which is all about the development of the situation at Fort Sumter. And that really kind of shone a light on sort of the perception of Seward versus what he actually thought about this developing situation. So that's kind of where that came from. But that's kind of the situation we find ourselves in at the kind of the beginning of the onset of hostilities and secession. But I wanted to let Chris talk about it because he actually had another really interesting idea about something that happens, interestingly enough, and it comes into play because with the delay of sort of the onset of hostilities, that kicks up things like the first Wheeling Convention in West Virginia that happens kind of in the fall and the winter of 1861, which I think is going to do a whole lot to this new timeline. And without stealing any more of Chris's thunder, I'll shut up and let him talk.
So Dylan talked a little bit about, I think it's appropriate to call it Seward's Southern strategy.
Yeah.
Just because of the Nixon tie-in you did.
I think I did that part 1 too.
That he's got these supporters. Lincoln, to some extent, had a similar idea, but it was more geographic focused. For those of you that are a little familiar with American geography, there's a place called West Virginia, and it does not exist until this point. What Dylan was hinting at is the Wheeling Convention is how West Virginia becomes a state, because it was part of Virginia, and it was the part of Virginia that basically supported what Seward thought a lot of other people did, which was secessionist madness. this really doesn't make any sense what we're doing, there's the argument to be made that here we go. Here it is. It is, call it 20 minutes in. I'm going to talk about economic theory.
Oh, we love it.
The part that economically doesn't have slaves, so they don't support secession to protect slaves or to protect slavery. But
Kind of hard to grow cotton in the mountains of West Virginia.
and you can kind of see like the areas that are not plantation economies do not necessarily, if you were to kind of, if we had Steve Karnacki's great-grandfather in front of a map actually looking at county by county results of these secession conventions, you're going to see that the areas that do not have plantation economies are not voting for secession. But the parts of Virginia that do not vote for secession basically form their own state. And what we talked about is we've already had basically Eastern Maryland try and secede. And having a little bit of local knowledge about Maryland, the parts of Maryland that are going to support that secession are going to be along the Chesapeake and kind of southern Maryland. If you imagine today a line of kind of modern Montgomery County and Frederick County, which go up to Pennsylvania, west, kind of about as far inland as DC is. Those areas, geographically, they look a lot more like West Virginia. They tend to be a little hillier. They don't have the plantation economies the way Eastern Maryland will. So what we talked about, especially given, by the way, the need to keep like a line of communication open to Washington, which is a huge deal. I think maybe what we talked about was not so much a West Virginia, but a state of Cumberland, which would incorporate kind of these parts of Virginia plus the western parts of Maryland that don't support the secession.
Or state of Shenandoah.
State of Shenandoah as well, because that's kind of, those are some geographic names that are important in this area. And that does lead us really well into another very important point, which is the Shenandoah Valley. If you can pull up a map and look at Interstate 81, I've driven it a couple of times. It cuts right down the Shenandoah. It cuts down western. It is in modern Virginia, but it cuts very close to the West Virginia border. And it's an area of flat farmland that actually was pretty well used by people like a Jeb Stuart in the Civil War as a highway, because if you remember the episode we did on the Peninsular Campaign, the one video episode we did, all of the rivers create this ladder that are very hard to move across. The Shenandoah has no such ladder. It is a flat plain, and it acts as a highway right up very close to Washington and into Maryland. And I think if the Union is playing with geographic areas supporting them, I think is the best way to put it, and paying attention to that, my God, I mean, one, you extend the front because now you're not fighting down 95. It can take hours to go 3 miles today in this area. I know that's all traffic. Even then, though, by extending it down, you have so much more territory that the South has to defend, which they can't because they don't have the people to do it. So that's really important, and that can really come into play in things. And the other part of it is it terminates down in, we talked about another new state kind of called Franklin, which is eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina areas, that, again, even in our timeline, had significant areas of support, significant pockets of support for the Union. And if you look at some of what Lincoln wrote, he was trying to get there and tap into that support because he knew it was there to support them. And one last thing, looking at looking at a map of this, what's right at the southern tip of all of this? Chattanooga, which, hey, Lookout Mountain and those battles there that opened the way to Atlanta and were really kind of the death knells of it all. So you might have, by political and other means, the Union getting very close to Atlanta in the 1862 campaign, maybe even the 1863 campaign, but basically by reorganizing kind of these Appalachian territories that support the Union, making life a lot harder on the Confederates.
Well, and I think that's important to keep in mind because while we had like West Virginia happen in our timeline, there was less of an emphasis on, like in our timeline, on carving out territories and carving out like states or areas that would be sympathetic to the Union. But instead, it was kind of more of like, underground support or like just really mainly on like battlefield victories per se. And I think this ties in very well to how we kind of overall see the war dynamic shifting is with the South recognizing that this isn't the Second American Revolution like they tried to portray it as in our timeline. They're really just fighting for the survival of the institution of slavery. Britain and France aren't going to help them. They aren't going to have like a General Lee trying to go and foray into Gettysburg, which Chris, by the way, noted in the pre-podcast that those campaigns were very much doomed to fail because he was not in the right part of Maryland and he was not in the right part of Pennsylvania for this to really succeed.
But there was no way that Hood was going to get anywhere near Philadelphia. They already hated the Cowboys back then.
Our obligatory football reference was thrown in. It had to be. I love that. But so rather than having that be the emphasis, the South basically trying to be a little bit more on the offense, a little bit more getting outside support. And as we also established in the previous episode too, the capital is way more likely to be somewhere like, Atlanta, Montgomery, or New Orleans, like in this timeline, as opposed to Richmond, Virginia. So the South is going to be, and this is kind of what we set out as a broad generalization in the pre-podcast, is the South is going to be more defensive. And as the war goes on, and we can get into specifics of this, of course, as we flesh this out, but the South will be more defensive, trying to hold on to territory, trying to, just keep its way of life together. And the North may be, especially from the outset, a little bit more once Seward realizes there's no Nixonian silent majority coalition. They might be a little bit more on the offense, and they might be seeing, the South kind of adopting a little bit more of a guerrilla warfare tactic, sort of defensive posturing. They'll just say, okay, if you're guerrillaing, we're going to guerrilla back. And I'm not talking about the Harambe type of guerrillas. I'm talking about in warfare, guerrilla, Guerr. But I digress. So the Union could probably not only be more offensive on the battlefield, but they can also try to help fund, insurgency groups, splinter groups for various states. And even in our timeline, we had dueling Confederate Union governments in states like Kentucky and Missouri. So there could be even a lot more of that sort of behavior taking place in the alternate timeline Civil War.
Well, and I think the other thing that's going to happen is, so in the original timeline Civil War, you have kind of two primary theaters. Which theater is our primary kind of shifts, but at the beginning of the war, you have the Eastern Theater kind of in the Roanoke and Shenandoah valleys and the Peninsula Campaign kind of on the eastern seaboard around D.C. And then you it's kind of a toss up which of the other ones is more important between sort of the Trans-Mississippi, basically Arkansas, Texas, all of that, or Tennessee and the Cumberland and kind of northern Tennessee, southern Kentucky. And as you start seeing Sherman's campaign, that becomes much more of an important theater. In this timeline, one, I think the Trans-Mississippi theater is going to be perceived as much less important. They're going to have troops out there, but it's going to kind of be like, all right, y'all are going to do what you're going to do at the kids' table while all the adults deal with the important stuff on this side of the Mississippi. And I think partially because of this recognition by the Confederates that they cannot achieve diplomatic recognition on the offensive. They're going to have to bring the Union to the bargaining table, not bring European powers to the table. I think the two different theaters that you're going to see, the Eastern Theater and sort of the near Mississippi, are going to be of drastically different characters, even from one to the other, not just from what we understand in our timeline, especially if you have this kind of new state of Cumberland that's kind of cutting off Virginia from Tennessee and Kentucky to some degree, especially if Richmond is still the capital, which one of the reasons why they moved from Montgomery, the original capital, is Montgomery is a hot, sweaty place with lots of mosquitoes, lots of yellow fever. And at the time, it had a grand total population of 8,000 people, almost half of whom were slaves. So basically, to the Confederate sort of upper crust mind, 4,000 people who actually matter. So I think, at least at the early stages, Richmond is going to be the capital because, Virginia is kind of the most blue-blooded Confederate state. But because of that, and because now not only do they have Union to the north, but also to the west of them in the kind of not the Alleghanies, the Appalachians, I think you're going to see on the Eastern Front maybe a much earlier development of what we saw later in the war on both sides, which is this kind of proto-trench warfare kind of embankments and defensive fortifications, especially if you have somebody like Joe Johnston, who is a former civil engineer and was trained as an Army engineer before the war. I think he makes a really interesting fit for the Confederates on kind of the seaboard front. Whereas once you get on the other side of this new state of Cumberland, especially into kind of middle and west Kentucky and Tennessee, the ground gets much flatter and it becomes much more of a wheeling, movement-based, hit-and-run cavalry campaign where you have a lot more flexibility of movement. So you're going to see guys like Jeb Stuart, Nathan Bedford Forrest, even into kind of that southern part of Missouri. Like you're going to see the James brothers be a much more important thing in this timeline. Like that's going to be the much more mobile theater. The Eastern Front is going to be kind of much more kind of grindy, attrition, defensive based, I think. And that's going to be really interesting for what that does to the development of both sides.
So the one thing I'm thinking about with the Eastern Theater, first, Joe Johnston was replaced by Lee. And one of the reasons Lee didn't get early commands is because the first thing he did when he got any command of Virginia troops was to order them to dig defenses. He was originally known as a King of Spades because he was so focused on that. So both of them in the East are very defensive works heavy. The other thing is, I kind of touched on it a little bit, there is no way looking at what their front represents that they can realistically hold their entire front with a kind of a West Virginia kind of Cumberland situation. It extends their front way too much. Now they've got to plug so many gaps that...
Yeah. But in terms of the philosophy, that's kind of going to be what they're governing. Because you also have to remember, on the Union side in the early stages of the war, you're looking at the two main generals in these theaters being George McClellan, who is famous for not doing a whole lot, and Don Carlos Buell, who is famous for managing to out McClellan at not doing a whole lot. So there's a difference that is going to happen between the execution of the idea and the idea itself.
And not to get too much kind of back to our Lenin episode. I promise this is going to make sense, or at least it does my. Yeah, I wish people could see Evan's face right now. Hold the other side, kill as many of them as you possibly can, and wait for their internal political structure to collapse.
Yeah.
That was Germany's strategy, and that is the only strategy that makes any sense if you're the Confederates. So let's dig a bunch of trenches and let the Union beat themselves bloody trying to take it. In the West, we can maneuver a little more. We let them into our areas and start ambushing to run up the casualty numbers and wait until 1864. Hope to survive until 1864. Let me say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or even survive until 1862 when you can actually have like some kind of reaction in the midterm.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I think, especially because in the early days, particularly, you have a significant portion of kind of fire eater, chicken hawk Democrats who are still in the U.S. Congress that are going to be agitating against this, the sort of pro-union Civil War position. The other interesting thing that does, especially out West, is, you know, in the Northeast, it's going to be what it's going to be. You know, you're going to have to fight them. But especially if you put states like Kentucky and, you know, the southern part of Missouri into more firmly pro-Confederate territory, is, you know, the states that are north of them are relatively recently states. Some of them are still territories. You know, it was only 10 years before this, 15 years before this, that you saw, you know, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You know, where does the term Jayhawk come from? Where does the term Sooner come from? It's from all these people. Well, Sooners is different, but
Sooners.
Yeah, I was gonna fact check you on that.
Sorry, yeah, you're right. I was lumping them in, but
and I'm
the
NFL
Jayhawks for
person,
sure. Yeah, the Jayhawks for sure. That comes from a term for these people that would rush into the state to try and advance their political position vis-a-vis slavery one way or the other. So at least out West, where there is less firm direct Union control over the states themselves, I can see the Confederates, kind of like the idea of with Britain and France trying to solicit them. I can see the Confederate government having the idea, whether it's got real actual potential or not, of trying to get some of the kind of western border states, like, you know, Illinois, maybe not quite, but like Minnesota, some of those places out there, at least to sit on the sidelines if they can foment enough uncertainty about what's going to happen.
I have a monkey wrench to throw in here that is one of these things that Chris will probably shoot down in 2 seconds. But in the absence of France and Britain, right, being solicited to help join the Southern side, what if the South turns to a different direction, which they kind of did a little bit in our timeline? You know, they tried to actually claim and hold on to or have some sort of, you know, something with regards to the Arizona territory. So where I'm going with this is the South makes this a little bit more personal and grievance based. Now that it's about slavery and not really about some esoteric concept of states' rights, which is really just, you know, slavery in nice clothing, the South kind of tries to lobby Mexico a little bit. And maybe say that Mexico is like, hey, we'll let you have a little bit of what the North took from you. You want to talk about Northern aggression, right? We took a lot of land from you. And if you help us out, maybe we'll give you back a little something, a little pat on the back. I don't know. Now, it might be a little awkward because Texas is in the South at this point. But what do you think about this?
I like yours. That's a very Zimmerman idea. But the problem that you're going to run into is at a certain point in this, during the Civil War, about 40% of Mexico suddenly starts speaking French and listening to polka. And so I think they're going to have their own problems that they're not going to want to deal with.
It makes almost less sense than the Zimmerman telegram. Zimmerman telegram is right in the middle of the Mexican Revolution. This is right in the middle of the last major upheaval before the Mexican Revolution of Maximilian coming in.
I was wanting to remember when this was happening because I knew that our friend Maximilian was involved somewhere.
I think
so.
I think the French intervention in Mexico was 63.
62.
Oh, it is. Oh, so yeah, so it's definitely in peak timeline to throw.
Yeah, they're gonna have their own problems that they're gonna be wanting to deal with.
Exactly.
It was worth a shot. I thought maybe it would have been.
I do like the idea. It is an interesting idea.
Yeah. But anyway,
I think
yeah,
it is a good idea. I do think, basically, I think what's going to end up happening is the beginning of the war is going to be much more kind of static, both because of the defensive fortifications and because of this giant shift in the terrain that everybody has to kind of figure out what to do with. I think what you're going to probably end up seeing long term is, because the Confederates are going to be purely on the defensive, and especially with this giant chunk that extends their front line that they have to deal with, I think you're going to see more immediate inroads on the western side, especially once in Kentucky and Tennessee, you're going to see more, not immediate, but quicker Union inroads into Kentucky and Tennessee. On the contrary to that, you're also going to see guys like Jeb Stuart and Forrest run rings around the Union as they make their way in. So it's going to be much more kind of guerrilla, James Gang, hit and run, partisan resistance type stuff that they're dealing with.
I should not have mentioned them. Mosby was the person. Mosby was a Confederate raider in Missouri. The James brothers were...
And Quantrill. Don't forget Quantrill.
Quantrill I'll give you as well. James brothers were nobodies.
No, I know, but like that kind of thing is just because it's the easy name for people to reference.
Right.
But they might have been nobodies in our timeline, relatively speaking, but maybe with this difference, they could have become a bit more prominent for sure in terms of their style.
Yeah, but the Eastern Theater, I think, at first becomes much more static. And I think that is going to, that staticity and McClellan, whenever he gets off his butt and actually trying to go against the Confederates, running into more of a meat grinder, I think that's going to actually, I think that's going to validate McClellan, though. Like, I think asking McClellan to do anything,
and that's what I'm
saying.
Like trying to nail jelly to the wall. Like, let's be real. And that was in our timeline. But here's something I want to posit.
Yeah,
I think Seward gets a lot more impatient.
Yes.
than even Lincoln was. I think that Seward is going to be cycling through generals until he gets somebody to do what he wants, because he's going to get more and more frustrated at the defensive posture, the meat grinder. He's going to start looking towards like the Grants and the Sherman types, which, by the way, maybe General Sherman gets transferred to the Western Theater and actually is elevated a little bit earlier than he was in our timeline. That I think would be really interesting.
Well, or I think on the political side, I think getting rid of McClellan earlier nips a lot of this Confederate hope for the 1864 election.
I would think so too, because McClellan ran against Lincoln in our timeline.
Yeah, so if McClellan's out because he fails to properly prosecute a war in a meat grinder in the East to some degree, he's on the outs by probably late 1863.
I think him getting fired because he doesn't want to drown the Confederates in our boy's blood almost strengthens his campaign.
I would say it would strengthen his political campaign. I think it weakens his military bona fides. But
and I think the interim is what changes the 64 election. But yeah, Evan's exactly right for what I'm thinking for the military side of it.
But what I'm thinking about is, so we've already, the kind of the campaigning season starts in 62.
Yeah.
So you're saying there's kind of useless attacks in the East.
Useless attacks in the East and more success in the West. But you also have to remember there is now technically a fourth middle front between the West and the East. And that is going to be something that they can't move on immediately because of the terrain. It takes time to build up enough to execute anything.
I think we're talking about Georgia.
Well, kind of Eastern Tennessee at this point, but yeah.
But yeah, and because that's going to wind up being the key.
We're talking about heading straight to Chattanooga.
That was why that is why, to some extent, McClellan lost in '64 because of the fall of Atlanta.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and then the
I
march.
mean that Sherman's success with the March to the Sea and Atlanta and everything was a huge thing in favor of Lincoln's reelection.
And
sure.
If the Union is able, I'm going to keep saying to go down 81, because if you look at a map, it is so perfect.
It's a straight shot.
Yeah.
It really helps you understand what we're saying. They're going to get down to Chattanooga area. If I can read a map,
so can they.
Sherman, Grant, somebody else. And so Seward is going to be cycling these generals, and somebody is going to win the lottery and be told, march from Chattanooga to Atlanta. Atlanta's almost more important now because of the Appalachian Cut as a means of communication and support for the Western theater.
I think there's no Anaconda plan, honestly. I think there's no emphasis early on.
I think actually the Anaconda plan exists. It is just shifted eastward.
It might be shifted eastward, yeah.
Because Anaconda was a Winfield Scott thing, so that was going to exist in some.
I mean,
form
even
fashion,
Winfield Scott could see.
He couldn't get on his horse, but he could read a map.
He could read a map.
You know what?
Still.
I feel like he could have been strapped on his horse long enough to go from Chattanooga to Atlanta. Again,
actually, no. In this timeline, they don't strap him on a horse. They literally winch him onto a boat, and then they just let him run the Anaconda plane, and that's it.
I just am picturing in my head right now a Titanic-like vision with an ancient Winfield Scott just like being, I don't know what the name is for like
I'm the king of
mermaids
the
or whatever.
world.
Yeah, but like what's the name
though.
of like the mermaid that tends to be at the
like
front
the
of the ship?
masthead?
Yeah,
No,
the
but
masthead.
that changes everything. That changes everything because Winfield Scott was too big to fit on the door.
All right, we have officially jumped the shark on this episode, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's all my fault.
Let's reel it back in.
But basically, go ahead, Evan.
Yeah, all I was going to say was just, where we shift like kind of the major theaters, major battle tactics. As we kind of maybe start, circling the drain a little bit here, given a very long-winded bringing the plane down for a landing. So how do we see the war maybe from a high level panning out differently? We've discussed like maybe different generals, different theaters, whatever. But I mean, I think the two main questions that we need to determine are Seward winning another term in 64 and how and when the war actually ends, because I don't really think personally there's any way that this significantly changes the South's, losing the war. Like, I still don't think with a difference of presidency and tactics, I think there really isn't much that would save the South, barring an alien invasion, barring France and Britain suddenly deciding that they are now pro-slavery again and want to help the South. Like, anything that's like just remotely not historical, very crazy. Like, I still don't see the South winning.
I think we have kind of the 63 campaigning season is kind of focused on taking Atlanta.
Yeah.
Our, just to kind of put perspective on this, in our timeline, July 63, literally at the same time, was Gettysburg and the fall of Vicksburg.
Right. Exactly. And I think Sherman's march to the sea wasn't until 64, if I remember correctly.
Late 64. He took Atlanta. 64 is when he's marching, because he kind of sends Lincoln a telegram trying to say Savannah is your Christmas present. So that's a very good way of understanding that timeline. But he took Atlanta and the fall of Atlanta is what won McClellan.
Yeah.
What defeated McClellan.
One Lincoln, yeah.
I think
if Seward focuses on kind of this central campaign front,
yeah.
63, they could take Atlanta, and once Atlanta falls, things fall quick. Now, the one thing I think is this. I do not see the Confederates winning, but I don't see the Confederates admitting they lost.
Yeah. I think
and I think it was very important, in our timeline, Johnston and Lee saying, and I mean, Longstreet even more than that, saying we lost, we need to admit we lost and get back together with this. That is very unique if you look at historical civil wars.
Yeah.
And in this circumstance, when it has always been about the abolition of slavery, and we talked about this a little bit, but let's be 100% honest. With that as a war goal from the very beginning, the United States would probably try and get a couple of crates of rifles down to Montgomery, so the other half of the population.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Is Abraham Lincoln, just as a Johnny come lately in our timeline on the issue of like emancipation, abolition, those kinds of things, he was very reticent to do that early on. And in fact, we all think of Lincoln as some sort of like, very pro like African-American civil rights kind of figure. He was widely revered and still is widely revered today as such. Read some of Lincoln's earlier writings and speeches to understand how racist he actually was against African Americans. Like, he really didn't have much of any personal sympathy for their situation. The only reason the Emancipation Proclamation happened is because he wanted to give the Union and recast the war as a righteous cause, not just a political cause. With this being a righteous cause from the very beginning, I can see maybe not even an Emancipation Proclamation for in 1863 or whenever that happened. I could see that being one of the first things that Seward does, and trying to, as hard as he can to, as you just said, Chris, counterinsurgency. Like, if the South is going to be doing, a forest style guerrilla tactic campaign, let's free all the slaves. Let's get them to line our brigades and our regiments as quickly as possible. And also, it would kind of help if they maybe slit some rebel throats here and there too. So I think that would make things a lot more ideologically driven and a lot more violent in terms of the early days and the mid of the war.
And so kind of what Dylan was saying, Nathan Bedford Forrest is going to be more important in the Western region. I think the way he viewed Reconstruction and the way he behaved during Reconstruction is also going to be a lot more emblematic of what you see after the political structure of the Confederacy collapses.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other interesting thing, so I think you're probably looking at kind of the last dregs of the formal war, probably going into like the political campaign season in 1864. I think if the war isn't formally won by election day, everybody's gonna know. It's gonna be the last couple weeks of the war, basically. So I think Seward is going to win kind of by a landslide, partially because of, he won the war, and partially because of, especially if it's not technically over yet, who certifies the electoral? Yeah, who certifies the electoral results?
It doesn't matter who votes.
Who's going to be
who counts the votes.
Who's going to be in Congress? Nobody but Republicans. So,
well, that actually brings up another interesting point. I think we can say, if you've got something else.
No, there was one other thing I wanted to go in at the same time, and it has to do with that Nathan Bedford Forrest guerrilla warfare style. In the midst of all this, we've talked about now kind of the Trans-Mississippi Theater being sort of the stepchild left out in the cold. And I think there is going to be the question of, okay, the people east of the Mississippi, not wanting to necessarily recognize that the Union won the war to some degree. I definitely think they're not going to want to recognize that the Union won the war west of the Mississippi, because, once you start getting into Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, that is a whole lot of country with not a whole lot of people in it, except for a lot of probably, especially former Confederates who I can very much kind of see going out that way, especially like 1865, 66, 67. Once you start getting into kind of the Wild West-ish days, I think, especially in places like Texas, Arizona, New Mexico territory, you are going to see much more kind of pro-Confederate sort of migration, and possibly even sort of like separatism. Like I can kind of see movements to sort of revive Texas as like an independent thing. And I think that's going to be a much more interesting long-term thing for like Reconstruction.
I could see, Dylan, you quickly mentioned Oklahoma. I would say the Oklahoma, I forget when the Sooners thing happens and when it formally becomes a state. Yeah, I think that was in the 1880s.
Real interesting seeing. I think part of what you're saying is right, Dylan. One, I want to say, I think the defenses keep the Union out of Richmond and out of Petersburg and out of a lot of areas. So you do have kind of a Weimar situation of people not realizing they got beat.
Yeah.
The other thing is, and I think we kind of discussed a possibility of a third part. I think we're there. I think
we're firmly in that territory.
I think we're kind of firmly in that territory because we haven't even touched upon Reconstruction.
and this is going to be interesting there. The whole Sooner thing. How do these kind of guerrilla Confederates relate to the Native Americans that are still a thing in the geographic area into which we're talking about them going?
That's exactly where I was heading towards, Chris, because keep in mind, a good number of Indian tribes, and even in our timeline, there was a decent degree of sympathy in like the Oklahoma Territory, from Indian tribes towards the Confederate side.
Nobody distrusts a strong central government more than the Native Americans.
More than Native Americans. Not only that, Native Americans, one could argue, had slavery in certain forms or fashions longer than the South did. So I think there's some kind of like political ties, not as much cultural, but just, remembrance of like the Andrew Jackson sort of days, Trail of Tears, which is what got a lot of the Indians to Oklahoma to begin with. So I think not only could we see that, like, obligatory reference to the Little Brothers Club, where I drew a map of an alternate American Civil War and it included Oklahoma in the South. I think we could, if we don't have them formally in the South as like a territory that the South cleaves off, they're at least going to be funneling support, I would say, somehow to the South. But something else I think that's going to be a huge change, which would lead to, like what Dylan said, a more Weimar Republic kind of situation, is what did Lincoln say? What did Lincoln do in terms of reintegrating the South and bringing the South back in? He viewed these people as, errant brothers. They're still part of us. They just kind of messed up a little bit. You know what? I'm going to be a little bit more kind and forgiving to them. All you need to do to be back in our country is 10% of the voters, like not even anywhere close to a majority, mind you. 10%. That's it. 1 out of every 10 people there sign a piece of paper saying that you're going to be loyal to the Union. That's it.
Seward,
and then they're back
Seward's
in.
going to be a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, Seward is just going to be like, oh, heck no. Like, you guys, we want to talk about reparations today, like, race-based reparations. We're going to be having, like, after the South gets decimated with its, well, maybe not the eastern part, but like I'd say the western part kind of becomes more of this, Sherman march to the sea kind of destruction of their infrastructure. And not to mention taking away here's the economy coming in again, Chris, economic basis.
I'm not even pushing it.
South. Yeah. We're pushing it for you, Chris. We're doing it for you. The economic basis of, the exploitation of free, slave labor, right? After all of that is taken away and everything burned to the ground, Seward's going to be like, by the way, pony up, pay us back, and you're not actually going to even be formally back in the Union like until I don't know what sort of list of demands he'll have, but I suffice it to say it's going to be maybe just a little bit more stringent than 10% of the voters. Like
And
basically
also-
most of the South becomes military administered districts. Like they're not even
my
states.
vice president isn't going to be a Southern Democrat. Tell you that right now.
Exactly. Exactly. That's
But-
not happening.
The other interesting thing is if you have more stringent demands like that, especially as regards to, like you said, Evan, a percentage of the population that has to support the Union, especially in this timeline where we have definitely already created one new state. We probably
cleaved off
created
all of the
two
Union
new
supported
states
territories
because of
yeah.
East Tennessee. The other interesting thing that you're going to maybe see, not necessarily a ton, but at least maybe a little bit, is the creation of other new states as not necessarily entire Confederate states, but chunks of them get enough people in sort of a sub-region to get readmitted to the Union.
That
Because
is a
obvious-
fascinating, yeah.
Because, obviously over time, the North, quote unquote, the Union, is going to lose some will to constantly station troops across the entire South as kind of a military occupation force. So they're going to look for these ways to incorporate some new states that they know they don't have to station troops in, just as kind of a natural transition back to civilian government. So I think, one of the weird things that this is going to do is, assuming some kind of relatively similar development to the modern day, the United States is going to have probably a few more, at least, if not a lot more, than 50 states.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very strong possibility for sure. And I'm gonna, as we start drawing to a close, I'm gonna try and limit myself here to just a couple of interesting thoughts that I had that could set us up for part 3. And in terms of like what the post-Civil War South and Reconstruction look like. But I'm just gonna say, I think we have a very like almost assassination in a box, like just waiting to happen here. Like in terms of the South's attitudes and how they're being, treated after the Civil War by William Seward. I mean, in our timeline, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by, a disgruntled, disaffected Marylander. And who else was also stabbed and almost lost his life on, at the same time? Secretary of State William Seward.
He was a Virginian. He crossed the border. He was a Virginian.
Chris got to make sure his state stays clean.
I was going to say, Chris is trying to make sure that there is no blood on the hands of Maryland there. But I digress. So, but just this idea of, okay, if that happened with a conciliatory president, relatively speaking, I just think there's even going to be way more of a motivation for an emphasis for in like either the waning days of the Civil War or once the war is completely lost. I think Seward is going to more likely than not fill out his second term. I think he gets killed personally by some sort of Southern terrorist, which I think would be very interesting for who his vice president is leading the Reconstruction.
Yeah, and I think that could be an interesting thing. We can talk about sort of, what that ticket looks like in 64 as a way to kind of start off our discussion of the next episode, just as kind of a good way to start the lay of the land.
Let's do that.
Yeah, my only thought is I think in this timeline, you lose, not that it's necessarily a bad thing, because obviously the Civil War ends earlier. I think you lose some of the kind of romantic poeticism of the Civil War that we have in our timeline. This kind of brother against brother thing, kind of wayward sons, the sort of almost Shakespearean kind of Walter Scott romantic tragedy of it. And one of the things that encapsulates that in our timeline, and I got this from the book that I just read, I did not realize that. So April 12th, 1861 is when Fort Sumter was fired on. They surrendered 2 days later on April 14th, 1861. April 14th, 1865, they re-raised the exact same flag that they had lowered on April 14th, 4 years earlier, to the day when Sumter surrendered. That same night, Lincoln attended Ford's Theater and was shot. So it's literally 4 years to the day, the beginning of the Civil War and kind of the capstone of the end of it with the Lincoln assassination. It's kind of one of those weird, kind of tragic but romantic, sort of like poetic things that we associate with the Civil War. And I wonder in sort of this timeline, I don't think, and obviously European listeners are going to have entirely different perception of the Civil War, but I think there is, in our timeline for Americans, this kind of perception of how the Civil War sort of was that is going to be a very different sort of perception in our timeline of how this war came about.
I agree, and I think that's a good thing because there's.
Oh no! Yeah, I think there's
you said
a lot of stuff,
bad. But you did not say the word lost cause, and the lost cause.
No, exactly.
All of them.
Yes.
Oh yeah,
I think
the mythos of the kindly General Lee, this sort of genteel Southern class that really maybe wasn't as racist as they were actually. Like all of that's out the window because your major Southern players are not going to be the General Lee types. They're going to be the most ardent.
They're going to be like the Nathan Bedford Forrests. There's still going to be something called the Lost Cause, but it is not going to be the sort of romantic, idyllic chivalry Lost Cause. It is going to be much more hardcore, like just violent, anarchist, just much more unpleasant kind of quote unquote Lost Cause than it is in our timeline. But it is one of those interesting things that, because we think about it so much in the way that we think about it, having learned about it the way that it happened, that sort of lens through which we view it being so totally different is just kind of one of those interesting things.
Yeah. And so I think, with the VP discussion, like I was trying to look back at our notes and I didn't write this down when I re-listened to part one, but who did we have? Did we have Bates as Seward's VP for term one? Or who did we end up with?
It was either Bates or Cameron. I couldn't remember which.
I was thinking it was Bates or Cameron. I'm pretty sure we said Bates. I personally feel like there's a pretty solid chance that Seward can go one of two directions with the 64 campaign. He either becomes very, very confident and, if the war is not won by the election, it's like towards the end, like he may either just keep Bates or keep whoever he had before. There's no real reason to change the horse halfway through the river. Or if we think of him as being a little bit more politically perceptive than he actually ends up being, kind of with our timeline and the alternate timeline, maybe this is where Lincoln comes in and he says, hey, I'm willing to give a little bit of a future of the Republican Party a shot here, with the war kind of almost wrapped up, helping me. He doesn't have to worry about having a tie-breaking vote in the Senate, for example, when it's already swamped with Republicans anyway. So why not give this kid Lincoln a shot? I mean, I put kid in heavy air quotes, but I don't know. What do you guys think? And yeah, we do need to, we're almost, I think, like an hour and 10 minutes here. So we should probably be wrapping this up. But I think we should just set that up and then let part 3 spread its wings next time.
Yeah, I do have an idea. I don't know about the VP pick. I think we can use as our springboard for part 3. I do want to go ahead and throw the Democrat in the ring, or the nominal Democrat. And I have a gentleman from Greenville, Tennessee, who is going to be now in the new state of Franklin, Tennessee, who you may remember from our timeline.
Andrew Johnson?
Exactly.
I don't know. Chris is shaking his head.
Chris has got a finger up. He's going to shoot it down.
I'm not going to shoot it down. I'm going to correct a factual statement. Andrew Johnson, not born in Tennessee.
No, but he was based in Greenville. So he wasn't born there, but his political career was based in East Tennessee.
He's from North Carolina.
Yeah.
You've come after both my states, and I'm not going to let that happen.
He's not taking that standing down, folks. All right. Well, I think that's about as good a time as any to put the cork back on this bottle. And I have a lot of really interesting, I'll just drop this as well. I think the pop culture implications of this, of Abraham Lincoln having a different career are going to be immense. But that's something that we're going to save for part 3. And I also have some economic theory too, as well, about the post-Civil War Reconstruction that I think is going to be very interesting to delve into as well. But dear listeners, those are all things that we're going to be talking about in the next episode. So if either of you have anything else you want to throw in at the very end, like I did, speak now, forever hold your peace. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in and listening. As we said at the beginning of the episode this time, we solicited some Discord feedback and commentary. We always appreciate when our listeners do give us our Discord feedback. So feel free to hop in there and just talk about what you think about this burgeoning arc. Part 3 will, I think, be where we end this. We're not creating another Little Brothers Club. So don't worry about that. But yeah, we always like your feedback and love hearing about ideas for other possible forks and topics as well. So, dear gentlemen, if there is a fork in the Shenandoah Valley of time, what, pray tell, do you think we should do with it?
Call it I-85.
No.
I-81.
80, actually 85 goes Petersburg to like Atlanta. So it has its own Civil War implications. My life on that too.
Yeah, we're finding every single way possible to bring out the bear and Chris throughout this episode. All right, everyone. Well, yes, if we see a fork in time, I think we should take it. Yep. Thanks so much, and catch you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.